It was a crisp, early morning when Jason arrived at the Green Ridge Golf Course, a place that had been a second home to him for years. He had played hundreds of rounds here, enjoying the calm and peaceful atmosphere that only a golf course could provide. The smell of fresh-cut grass and the soft hum of nature in the background had always helped him clear his mind. However, that morning felt different. The air had an unusual weight, as if something unseen was hanging just above him, waiting for the right moment to fall. As Jason stepped out of his car, he noticed the course was eerily silent. Normally, the parking lot would be bustling with golfers and caddies preparing for the day's play. But this morning, there was no chatter, no clinking of clubs, and no sound of balls being driven down the fairways. The course appeared deserted, though the lights in the clubhouse indicated that someone was around. Jason shrugged it off, assuming it was just the early hour and the season's off-peak time. He made his way to the first tee, the familiar steps bringing back memories of countless rounds. The morning mist hung low over the greens, creating an ethereal blanket that softened the harsh lines of the landscape. As he lined up his first shot, he felt a strange sensation, like someone was watching him. He paused, glancing around, but there was no one. Just the fog, the trees, and the distant outline of the clubhouse. The feeling was fleeting, but it unsettled him, so he shook it off and swung the club. The ball flew straight and true, landing perfectly in the fairway. Jason continued down the course, but as he reached the second hole, the feeling of unease grew. It wasn't just the absence of other players. It was something more. The greens seemed too pristine, the air too thick, as if the course itself was holding its breath. The wind was still, yet there was a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, as if the grass was whispering to him. At first, he dismissed it as the wind moving through the leaves, but as he approached the second hole's tee box, he could hear it more clearly. The whispering wasn't random. It seemed deliberate, as if the grass itself was trying to communicate with him. He paused again, his heart racing slightly. "Who's there?" Jason called out, half expecting a prankster to step out of the bushes. But there was no response, just the whispering, which seemed to grow louder and more urgent, though still unintelligible. He shook his head, tried to push the thought away. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks on him. Too many late nights, perhaps. But as he moved forward, the whispers followed him, a constant presence on the periphery of his senses. He tried to focus on the game, but every time he hit the ball, the noise would shift direction, as though the grass itself was reacting to his movements. By the time he reached the fourth hole, Jason could no longer deny it. Something was wrong. The whispering was no longer subtle. It was clear, almost like a chant, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Help me. You must stop. We will find you." The whispers grew clearer as he walked along the fairway. Jason's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on his club. The words were impossible to ignore now. He was no longer alone. Someone was trying to communicate with him, and the message was becoming darker by the moment. His breath quickened, and he glanced over his shoulder, but the fog had thickened, and the landscape seemed almost dreamlike. At the next hole, Jason found himself at the edge of the woods. The whispers seemed to grow louder, and something about the trees, how they loomed so still and silent, made his skin crawl. As he prepared to swing, a figure appeared at the far end of the fairway. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned golf attire, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Jason's stomach twisted. There was something unnervingly familiar about the man, as if he had seen him before in a dream. Before Jason could react, the figure disappeared into the mist, leaving nothing behind but the oppressive silence. He stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, unsure whether to continue or turn back. But the course seemed to beckon him forward, and against his better judgment, he took his next shot. The ball sailed through the air, but when it landed, something was wrong. The fairway wasn't where it should have been. It was as if the course had shifted, rearranging itself, as if the land itself was alive and malevolent. Jason's pulse quickened as he approached the spot where his ball had landed. The terrain had changed. There was no longer a clean path to the next hole, only a jagged expanse of broken earth and twisted grass. The whispering had returned, louder than ever, swirling around him like a storm. "Turn back," the voice seemed to say, before it's too late. For the first time in years, Jason felt the urge to leave. But something about the course, something about the land, had ensnared him. It wasn't just the whispers anymore. It was the overwhelming sense that the very ground beneath his feet was alive, conscious, and watching. The course wasn't just a place to play golf anymore. It had become something else entirely. Something dark and ancient. And Jason, whether he realized it or not, was now part of it. As he walked toward the clubhouse, the fog seemed to swallow him whole, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, they stopped. The air grew still once again, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Jason could no longer tell if the course had changed him or if it had always been this way, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right player to stumble upon it. But one thing was certain. This was no ordinary golf course. And Jason had just begun to understand what it truly was. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the Green Ridge Golf Course. The eerie whispering, the shifting landscape, and the strange figure had all been too unsettling to ignore. That evening, he sat in his apartment, replaying the events of the day over and over in his mind. The whispers, the sudden appearance of the old golfer, the way the fairways seemed to distort and shift under his feet. None of it made sense, and yet it felt like it was all connected in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He decided to return to the course the next morning, determined to uncover the truth. Maybe it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, or perhaps there was some rational explanation for what had occurred. Regardless, Jason knew that leaving unanswered questions would only drive him mad. Something deep inside him told him that whatever was happening at Green Ridge had been there long before he arrived, and it wouldn't stop unless he uncovered what lay beneath the surface. The next morning, the fog was heavier than before, blanketing the entire course in an impenetrable shroud. Jason's car crunched over the gravel parking lot, the sound of the tires unsettling in the silent atmosphere. He noticed that the clubhouse windows were dark. There was no sign of life. No caddies, no golfers, no staff. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he stepped out of the car and made his way to the first tee. The course seemed abandoned, but there was an overwhelming sense of expectation in the air. Something was waiting for him. As he stood at the first hole, staring down the fairway, Jason couldn't help but feel as though he was being drawn into the course's strange web, unable to break free. The whispering had not returned, but the silence was even more unnerving. The wind, usually a constant companion on the course, was absent. The trees stood frozen, like ancient sentinels, their limbs still and lifeless. Even the grass seemed unnaturally quiet, no longer rustling or swaying in the breeze. It was as though the entire course was holding its breath. Jason took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He lined up for a shot, but just as he was about to swing, something caught his eye. Near the second hole, there was an area of the course he didn't recognize. The grass was oddly uneven, and the ground seemed to dip inwards, as though there was a hole that had been carefully concealed. He had walked this course countless times before, yet he was certain this spot didn't exist the day before. Without thinking, Jason walked over to investigate, curiosity driving him forward despite the warning bells ringing in his mind. As he neared the dip in the ground, he noticed something strange. The earth seemed to shimmer, as if the hole itself were alive, a dark and pulsating presence beneath the surface. The edges of the hole were jagged, and the surrounding grass was unnaturally dry, as though it had been scorched by something unseen. Jason crouched down, his fingers brushing the edges of the earth. It was cool to the touch, yet there was a palpable energy radiating from within, a pull that seemed to beckon him closer. Without fully understanding why, Jason dropped to his knees and began to dig. The soil was loose, almost too loose, as if the earth itself was eager to be uncovered. His hands worked frantically, and before long, his fingers brushed something cold and metallic. With a gasp, he pulled it out, revealing an old, rusted metal object, a club head, worn and twisted beyond recognition. But there was something even more disturbing about it. The metal was etched with strange symbols, none of which Jason could identify. They were ancient-looking, as if they belonged to a language that had been forgotten by time. A chill ran through Jason's spine as he stared at the object in his hands. The club head seemed to throb in his palms, its power undeniable. He couldn't help but feel as though it was somehow connected to the whispers, to the strange occurrences that had been haunting him. The longer he held it, the more he felt that the course was alive, aware of his presence, and that whatever had caused this strange disturbance was still waiting, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be released. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Jason snapped his head around, but the fairway was empty. He stood up, heart pounding, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. No one. Only the thick fog curling around the trees like a living thing. Jason took a few unsteady steps back, the strange object still in his hands. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't meant to be touched, like it had been buried for a reason. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but as he turned to walk away, something stopped him. The hole, the one he had just uncovered, was now larger. It had widened as though something had shifted beneath the surface. And there, in the darkened earth, Jason saw something else. Another object, just barely visible beneath the soil. His breath caught in his throat as he reached down again, pulling out another piece of metal, this one shaped like a club, but far older, more intricate than the first. Its handle was cracked and worn, yet still held an eerie gleam, as if it had been waiting for him. Jason's mind raced. Two objects, both buried deep in the earth. He could feel the energy pulsating between them, as if they were connected, part of a larger whole, a larger plan. And then the whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder. "You found us." The voice was no longer muffled. It was clear, direct. "Now you must play the game." A sense of dread washed over Jason as the ground beneath him began to tremble. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, but it quickly escalated. The fog thickened, swirling violently around him, and the temperature dropped. In the distance, the faint figure of the old golfer appeared again, this time closer than before. His hat obscured his face, but Jason could feel his presence like a shadow, looming over him, watching. Jason took a step back, the metal clubs now clutched tightly in his hands. He realized with growing horror that the course had not been calling him. It had been waiting for him. There was a game to be played, and Jason had just stepped into its arena. The hole in the ground, the strange symbols, the whispers, it was all part of something much older, much darker than he could have ever imagined. As the ground continued to shake beneath him, Jason knew one thing for certain. He had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The game had begun. Jason's heart pounded as the fog thickened around him, the world seeming to close in with every passing second. The ground continued to vibrate beneath his feet, and the old golfer's figure, still shrouded by his wide-brimmed hat, lingered at the edge of the fairway, as though waiting for Jason to make his next move. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to echo through the very earth itself, taunting him, beckoning him closer to the heart of the course's hidden evil. But before he could react, a voice broke through the haze, sharp and urgent. "Don't go near it," the voice said, startling him. Jason spun around, his pulse racing, expecting to find another figure emerging from the fog. Instead, standing just behind him was a man he had never seen before, a caddy, dressed in the standard uniform of the course, though his attire looked worn and old-fashioned, as if he had stepped out of another time. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a kind of desperate intensity. Jason, still shaken by the events of the past few minutes, took a step back, unsure whether this new figure was part of the game or just another trick of the course. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain calm. "What's happening here?" The caddy's eyes darted nervously, as if he feared being overheard by something lurking in the mist. "I've been here before," he said in a low voice, barely above a whisper. "I've seen it happen. Seen what happens when someone gets too curious. It's not just a golf course, you know. It's a prison, a place that traps people, makes them part of its game. And once you start, you can't stop. You can't leave." Jason frowned, a mixture of confusion and skepticism clouding his thoughts. A prison? What are you talking about? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting the ground to start shifting again, or for the figure of the old golfer to vanish and reappear closer. This is just a golf course. I've been coming here for years. The caddy shook his head solemnly, his eyes flicking nervously toward the hole he had uncovered moments earlier. This course was built over something ancient, something that was never meant to be disturbed. People think it's just a game, but it's more than that. It's a ritual, a curse that binds everyone who plays here. His voice trembled with fear. The hole you dug, the one you uncovered, it's only the beginning. The game always begins like this. One player, one hole, one curse. But it's always bigger than you think. Jason's mind reeled. He had always thought of golf as an escape from the pressures of life, a game to unwind. He had never considered the possibility that it could be anything more than that. But what about the golfer? The man I saw earlier. Who is he? The caddy swallowed hard, glancing at the fog in the distance. That's the old one, the one who started it all. He's the reason the course is like this. He plays the game, but he's never left. You'll see him again, but don't follow him. Don't let him lead you. If you do, you'll become like him. Trapped in the game forever, always playing, but never winning. Jason could feel his chest tighten. He had no idea what the caddy was talking about, but the dread that gripped him told him that there was some truth to his words. The whispers had returned, rising in volume, as though they were reacting to the caddy's revelation. He looked down at the two twisted metal clubs in his hands. The strange symbols etched into them pulsed with a faint, almost magnetic energy, as if they were calling to him. A part of him, despite the fear, felt drawn to the hole in the ground, to the center of the course where it all seemed to begin. But another part of him, the part that was still rational, still human, fought to break free of the pull. I don't understand. What does this all mean? Jason asked, his voice shaky. Why me? Why is this happening now? The caddy met his gaze, his eyes filled with a deep, haunted knowledge. It's always someone, always a new player. The course chooses, and once it has you, you don't leave. I've been here for years, years too many to count, and I've watched others fall into the same trap. They don't listen. They think they can beat it. They think they can walk away. But no one does. Jason felt the weight of the caddy's words pressing on him like a heavy hand. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the fog thickening with each passing moment. The ground beneath his feet felt alive, as though the course itself was trying to hold him in place, not letting him leave. The old golfer's figure had disappeared, but Jason knew it was only a matter of time before he reappeared. And when he did, the game would resume. I don't have a choice, do I? Jason said quietly, more to himself than to the caddy. The game has already started. The caddy's face twisted with sorrow. It's already too late, he said softly. You're in it now. The course won't let you go unless it's ready to. You'll play until it decides you've had enough. Some players last days, some last years, and some never make it out. Jason took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had always been a competitive person, but this was different. There was no winning here. There was no scoreboard. There was only survival, and he wasn't sure how long he could survive if the game kept escalating like this. Just remember, the caddy added, his voice lowering to a near whisper, don't trust the course. It will offer you rewards, promises of escape, of victory. But the moment you think you've won, that's when it takes everything from you. Play the game, but play carefully. It knows what you fear. Before Jason could respond, the caddy turned and melted into the fog, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. The air grew still once again, and Jason was left alone on the fairway, the strange club still clutched tightly in his hands. The whispers continued, swirling around him like a vortex of unseen voices, urging him onward. His mind felt clouded with uncertainty and dread, but one thing had become painfully clear. The game had already begun, and the only way out was to finish it, whatever that might mean. Jason's pulse quickened as the fog swallowed the caddy whole, leaving only the heavy silence behind. The whispers, once distant and disembodied, now felt unervingly close, wrapping around him like a tightening noose. Each breath he took seemed to draw the fog deeper into his lungs, and the chill in the air prickled against his skin. He glanced once more at the strange clubs in his hands. The symbols that adorned them now glowed faintly, their meaning still unclear, but their presence increasingly ominous. He couldn't help but feel the sense that the course itself was watching him. Every blade of grass, every tree, every rock aligned in some grand, unseen scheme. The caddy's warning echoed in his mind. The course chooses, and once it has you, you don't leave. The word seemed like an impossibility, a bizarre myth spun out of fear. And yet, as Jason looked out over the course, the beautiful yet unsettling landscape that stretched in every direction, the truth of those words began to sink in. There was no escape. There were no simple answers. Whatever was happening at Green Ridge wasn't just about golf. It was about something far darker, something that had been festering beneath the surface for much longer than Jason had been alive. The fairway in front of him stretched endlessly, the path to the green now obscured by thick layers of fog. The sun, once a source of warmth and comfort, barely pierced through the haze, casting long, twisted shadows across the course. Even the holes themselves had started to look distorted, their edges blurring into nothingness, as though the course was shifting with every step he took. He couldn't help but feel that the boundaries of reality had become porous, like stepping into a dream, one that refused to let go. Jason's feet moved on their own, a mechanical walk driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. He knew he should turn back, should leave before the course claimed him too. But there was something at the back of his mind, a nagging curiosity, a thirst for answers. What had the caddy meant by the game? How was it played? Was there truly a way to win? Or was the only way forward to succumb, to be absorbed into the very fabric of the course? As he approached the green, a sinking feeling settled in his gut. The hole was more than just an opening in the ground now. It was a yawning maw, one that seemed to stretch far deeper than it had any right to. Jason paused for a moment, his gaze flickering back toward the distant clubhouse, which now appeared to be a shadow, as though the building itself had faded into the mist. The course had him now. He could feel it, the pull, the invisible force urging him closer to the edge. The hole was wider than before, its edges darker, as if the very earth itself were oozing something from within. He could feel the energy emanating from it, heavy and suffocating. In the center of the hole lay a glint of metal, just barely visible beneath the surface of the soil. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down, instinctively reaching for the object. As his fingers brushed against the cool metal, a surge of energy shot through him, sharp and electrifying. The hole trembled, and the ground beneath him shifted as though something alive had stirred beneath the earth. Jason pulled the object free, a third metal club, its surface etched with the same strange symbols. This one was different, more intricate, its craftsmanship far superior to the others. It felt heavy in his hands, as though it were an extension of something far older, far more powerful than anything he had encountered before. It was both beautiful and terrifying, and as he held it, he could feel the course whispering to him again, the voices louder, more urgent. "You are one step closer," the voices murmured, their tone now unmistakably human, laced with a malevolent satisfaction. "The game is almost complete. Only one more piece remains. Only one more player." Jason's stomach twisted. One more player? What did that mean? His mind raced, but before he could process the implications, a soft sound reached his ears. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the fog. The same figure from before, the old golfer, appeared once again at the edge of the green. This time, he was closer than ever, his form almost solid, his posture unbent despite his apparent age. His eyes were hidden behind the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat, but Jason could feel the weight of his gaze, even from a distance. Jason tried to back away, but his body felt stiff, as though the fog itself had solidified around his legs. He tugged once, then twice, but it was no use. The ground seemed to have a grip on him, unwilling to release him. The old golfer stepped forward, The sound of his shoes on the wet grass, the only sound breaking the eerie silence. "You found all the pieces," the golfer said in a voice that was both dry and rasping, like the rustle of dead leaves in an autumn wind. "But there is always a price to pay, my friend. No game is won without sacrifice." Jason's breath hitched in his throat. The old man was speaking as though he were familiar with him, with the situation, as though this moment had been scripted long ago. "What do you mean?" Jason demanded, his voice hoarse. "What is this game? What do you want from me?" The golfer chuckled softly, the sound unsettling, like gravel grinding beneath heavy boots. "What we all want, son. We want to finish what was started. The course was built for us by us. We have waited for decades for someone like you to come, to play the game, to complete it. But what you don't understand, what you fail to realize, is that you are not here by accident. You were chosen just like the rest of us. The course needs a winner, but it also needs its due." Jason felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The whispering had returned, louder than ever, as though the ground itself was speaking to him, urging him to listen. The figure of the golfer seemed to grow taller with each step, his presence growing heavier. The two metal clubs Jason had found lay in his hands like an anchor, and he could feel their power, their pull, threatening to drag him deeper into the mystery of the course. As the golfer's shadow stretched across the green, Jason realized something he had refused to see before. There was no escape. He had crossed the line, and now the only way forward was to play, to finish the game, whatever it might cost. The green stretched before him, the hole at its center, a symbol of everything he had yet to face. And he knew, without a doubt, that this game was far from over. Jason stood frozen at the edge of the green, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The old golfer, his figure looming larger than life, remained motionless before him, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the grass. The ground beneath Jason's feet still trembled slightly, and the whispering voices had now risen to a deafening crescendo, like a choir of forgotten souls begging to be heard. He felt the cold touch of the metal clubs in his hands, the symbols still glowing faintly, as if urging him towards something he could not yet understand. The old man tilted his head slightly, his gaze hidden beneath the brim of his hat. "You're at the center of it now," the golfer said, his voice deep and gravelly, like the earth itself was speaking through him. "This is where it all ends and where it all begins. The game has one final stroke to be played, and you are the one who must play it." Jason's heart pounded in his chest. The words the golfer spoke sent a chill through his veins, each syllable adding to the oppressive weight of the moment. He had thought he was merely playing a round of golf, a simple, relaxing game. But now, with every step he took, every word exchanged, the course felt like something far more sinister, a place where the boundaries of time and reality had become blurred. He wasn't just on a golf course anymore. He was trapped in some kind of ritual, a game designed for reasons he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "What do you mean, the last stroke?" Jason asked, his voice hoarse, barely audible above the rising murmur of the voices in the fog. His grip on the clubs tightened involuntarily, the cold metal sending a jolt through him. "What are you asking me to do?" The old golfer took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, as though measuring each action with care. "There is a balance to this game," he explained, his tone almost patient, as if he were teaching a child about the rules of a complex puzzle. "You have already found the pieces, the clubs, the hole, the path. But now you must make your choice. You can finish the game, complete the stroke, and you will have your freedom. Or," his voice trailed off, leaving the word hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. "Or you can refuse, and the course will take from you what it has taken from others before." Jason's stomach twisted. The meaning behind the golfer's words was clear enough. Finish the game, or be consumed by it. But the weight of that choice was unbearable. He could feel his own fear rising, like a flood breaking through a dam. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape, to leave this twisted place behind. But his feet remained rooted to the spot. He was trapped, not by chains or ropes, but by something far more insidious. The pull of the course, the force that had ensnared him without his consent. "Why me?" Jason demanded, his voice shaking. What did I do to deserve this? I'm just a guy trying to play some golf. I didn't ask for any of this. His words felt empty, as if speaking them made them less real, less tangible. He wanted to believe this was all just a nightmare, but the sensation of the ground beneath him, the coldness of the clubs in his hands, told him otherwise. This wasn't a dream. It was happening, and he had no idea how to stop it. The old golfer's lips curled into a faint, almost pitying smile. You didn't do anything, Jason. You're here because you were chosen, just as all the others were. The course selects its players, and when it calls, you answer. It doesn't matter who you are, what you've done. It's the game that matters. The course always claims its winners. He reached out slowly, almost ceremonially, his hands hovering over the metal clubs in Jason's grip. But winning is not the same as surviving. Jason recoiled, stepping back, the unease in his chest swelling into a full-blown panic. The fog pressed closer, thick and suffocating. The sounds of distant screams, distant but eerily familiar, floated on the air, merging with the incessant whispers. His head spun, and he couldn't tell if he was hearing these sounds because they were truly there or because his mind was unraveling. He looked at the hole again, that gaping, dark maw, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if it was calling to him, not just with the promise of escape, but with something far darker, something more enticing than he could resist. I don't want to play anymore, Jason whispered, more to himself than to the golfer. But the words felt futile, as if he were pleading with the wind to stop howling. The game had already begun, and it had no intention of ending. The golfer's smile faded, his expression turning grim. You've already played. There is no quitting now. It's not about whether you want to play, it's about whether you can. Every player who comes here faces the same choice. Finish it, or be swallowed by it. He nodded toward the hole. The ball is already in motion. You are the one who must take the last stroke, or you will become part of the course, just another lost soul trapped in its grip. Jason's hands trembled, and he realized with a sudden clarity that the golfer wasn't just offering a choice. It wasn't just a matter of winning or losing. It was a matter of whether he would become a part of the course itself. Would I become the next ghost wandering these fog-shrouded fairways? He wondered, is that the price of playing? The whispers had become a roar now, and Jason felt his chest tighten as the air grew colder still. The figure of the golfer seemed to blur at the edges, his presence becoming almost ghost-like, as though he too were a part of the course, an eternal participant in a game that had no end. Jason's eyes darted between the hole and the golfer, the choice before him feeling more impossible than ever. If he took the stroke, if he completed the game, would he be free? Or was there something far more sinister at work, something that only the course itself knew, and that no player ever left alive? His thoughts swirled into chaos, but then something inside him shifted. Something deep, primal, a flicker of defiance. I'm not like the others. I won't let this place take me. He took a deep breath, his fingers curling around the club's handle. His future was in his hands now, and the last stroke was the only thing that stood between him and the darkness that threatened to consume him. With a final glance at the golfer, Jason stepped forward, ready to play the last stroke. As Jason prepared to make the final stroke, the world around him seemed to dissolve further into a haze. The fog, which had already crept up to his knees, now swallowed everything beyond his immediate vicinity. It was as though the green had vanished entirely, leaving him alone in an abyss of white mist, the edges of the world smudged and warped. The whispers had died down, but the oppressive silence that followed was far more suffocating. In this eerie calm, Jason could feel the weight of the decision he was about to make. The club in his hands, heavy and unnerving, almost pulsed with an otherworldly energy, as if it were alive, waiting for him to complete the act. The golfer's words echoed in his mind. Finish it, or be swallowed by it. Jason gripped the club tighter, the cold metal biting into his palms. The hole before him seemed impossibly deep, the ground around it blackened, as if the earth itself were eager to devour whatever was thrown into it. The entire scene was alien, an odd hybrid of something familiar and something deeply disturbing. This was no longer a game of golf. It had become a ritual, a dark ceremony where the stakes were nothing less than his soul. Taking a step forward, Jason positioned himself carefully. His feet felt as though they were sinking with each movement, the very ground beneath him pushing back, resisting his every step. The golfer, who had been standing eerily still, now watched with a cold, disinterested gaze. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick, the air laden with expectation. It wasn't just a game anymore. There was a sense of inevitability in the way the course surrounded him, as if it had been waiting for this moment, for Jason to step into his role as its next participant. Jason swung the club back, his body stiff, reluctant. The movement felt mechanical, as if his actions were being dictated by forces beyond his control. He could almost feel the pulse of the course beneath his feet, its ancient, unseen power pushing him forward. His heart raced, and for the briefest moment, he considered abandoning the game entirely. He could drop the club, turn around, and leave. He could fight the pull that the course had on him. But he knew, deep down, that it wouldn't work. The course had him now, just as it had taken every other player before him. There was no escape. There was only one way out, and it was through the hole. With a breath that felt both shallow and suffocating, Jason took the final swing. The club made contact with the ball, the sound of the strike reverberating through the fog like a gunshot in the dead of night. The ball rolled slowly, almost lazily, toward the hole. Jason watched it move, his gaze fixed on its trajectory, his heart pounding louder with each passing second. Was this the moment? Would it finally be over? Would he be free? The ball continued to roll, and for a moment, Jason felt a flicker of hope. But as it neared the hole, something changed. The ground shifted beneath it. The hole, once a simple indentation in the earth, seemed to expand, its edges growing jagged, the darkness within it deepening. The ball dropped out of sight, swallowed by the hole with a sickening finality. But that wasn't the end. Jason's stomach churned as the ground trembled again, this time more violently. The fog around him thickened, swirling like a vortex, pulling at him from all directions. The very air seemed to crackle with energy, and Jason could feel the invisible force of the course tightening its grip on him. He staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. It hadn't ended. The game hadn't finished. It was only just beginning. The golfer, who had stood silent until now, finally spoke again, his voice a low, unsettling rasp. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" he asked, almost mockingly. "You thought that the game had a clear ending, that the hole would swallow your ball and set you free. But the game does not work like that. It is never so simple." Jason's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? I made the stroke. I finished the game. Why isn't it over?" The golfer's lips twisted into a smile that seemed to distort his features, turning them into something unnatural. "The hole takes, but it does not release. The stroke you made is the beginning of the end, not the end itself. You've given the course what it wanted, and now the course will take what it is owed." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The whispers returned, louder this time, growing chaotic and frantic. They seemed to be rising from all around him, from the depths of the hole, from the very grass beneath his feet. The sound was deafening, maddening. He could no longer tell where the voices were coming from or who they belonged to. But he knew, with a sickening certainty, that they were the voices of those who had come before him, the lost players who had become part of the course. The fog began to shift once more, and Jason felt a strange pull in his chest, as though something was drawing him toward the hole. It was not a physical force, but something more insidious, a mental compulsion, an undeniable need to get closer. He struggled against it, but his body moved of its own accord. Each step felt like wading through thick, wet sand. His limbs felt heavy, as though the very air around him had thickened, making each movement more laborious. He reached the hole. The darkness within it now seemed endless, a swirling abyss that beckoned him forward. The ground trembled again, and Jason realized, with horror, that the course was alive. It was not just a place. It was a living entity, one that had grown over decades, centuries perhaps, feeding on the souls of those who had played its game. The hole was not an end, but a beginning, a gateway, perhaps, to something far worse than Jason had ever imagined. A cold hand clutched at Jason's heart, and he was forced to lean over the hole, peering into its depths. The ball, the one he had struck so many moments ago, was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was something else, something far darker, far more terrifying. A pair of eyes glimmered from the depths of the hole, their cold gaze locked onto his. For the first time, Jason understood. He understood the truth of the game. The stroke, the hole, the fog, it wasn't just a challenge. It was a cycle, and now he was a part of it. He had been chosen not to escape, but to join the course, to become part of its endless, soul-devouring game. The eyes blinked slowly, and a voice, not the golfer's but something far deeper, resonated from the hole itself. "Welcome," it whispered, "to the game that never ends." Jason stood at the edge of the hole, his hands trembling violently, sweat slicking his brow despite the chilling air. His pulse thundered in his ears, drowned out only by the unsettling whisper of the fog that now seemed to envelop him completely. It wasn't just the voices anymore. The fog itself had a presence, a sentience that gnawed at his mind, its weight pressing in from all sides. The golfer had disappeared, his figure swallowed by the mist like a fleeting memory. Jason was alone now, truly alone, and yet he could feel the course around him, alive, watching, waiting. The voice from the hole still lingered in his mind, echoing in the pit of his stomach like a nightmare that refused to let him wake. "Welcome to the game that never ends." The words felt like chains, invisible shackles that had shackled his very soul. He had thought he had been playing a game of golf, a simple pastime, an escape from the mundane, but he was wrong. This wasn't a game. This was something far darker, something ancient and unyielding, a force that had claimed countless others before him and would no doubt claim countless more after. Jason took a step back, but the ground beneath his feet resisted. It was as if the course itself was rejecting him, refusing to let him leave. The sky above him, once a pale blue, had shifted to a menacing gray, swirling like a storm waiting to break. The trees, the fairways, the bunkers, everything around him now felt like a part of something far older, a place where time itself bent to the whims of a malevolent force. The hole before him, once a simple target, now seemed to pulsate with an unnatural energy, like a heart beating just beneath the surface of the earth. He could feel the pull again, a deep, gnawing compulsion to step closer to the hole. His feet moved against his will, his body betraying him, dragging him toward the abyss that waited to consume him. With each step, the whispers grew louder, their frantic tones urging him to submit, to accept his fate, to play the game. But Jason resisted. He fought against the force, his mind screaming to break free, but his body was weak, his muscles heavy with fear. He had no choice but to keep moving forward, as though bound by some invisible tether. The moment his foot crossed the line of the hole, a shockwave of cold shot through him. The air around him thickened, and the fog grew even denser, coiling around him like a serpent constricting its prey. He gasped, trying to breathe, but it felt as though the air itself had become too thick, too suffocating. He couldn't see. He couldn't think. He could only feel the pull, the relentless draw of the course, as though it were dragging him into its depths, claiming him as its own. Then, as if in answer to his silent plea for an escape, a sound cut through the thick fog, a sound of something snapping, like branches breaking. Jason's eyes snapped open, and for the first time he saw it. Emerging from the fog, like a figure from a forgotten dream, was the golfer, his tall form casting a shadow that stretched impossibly long. His face, once shrouded by a wide-brimmed hat, was now visible in the dim light. But it wasn't the face of the same man Jason had seen before. It was a face twisted, distorted, as though time and decay had eroded it to something unrecognizable. The golfer's smile was wide, but it was no longer reassuring. It was twisted, a grotesque mockery of happiness. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" he asked, his voice an unsettling blend of pity and amusement. This course, it doesn't just take lives. It takes time. It warps it. Those who are chosen, like you, are part of a cycle, a game with no end. Once you've played, you can never leave. You'll walk this course forever, bound by the rules you cannot escape. Jason's heart skipped a beat, his mind reeling. No, that's impossible. I'm not dead. I'm still alive. He tried to speak the words aloud, to reassure himself that this wasn't happening, but the truth was undeniable. The golf course around him had transformed into something far worse than any nightmare. This place was no longer a game. It was a prison, and Jason, whether he liked it or not, was its newest inmate. The golfer's form seemed to shimmer for a moment, and Jason's eyes widened as the figure before him morphed, shifting through different forms, each one more unsettling than the last. At first, it was just a fleeting change in posture, a quick flicker of movement, but then it began to change faster, too fast for Jason's mind to comprehend. The figure became a blur, warping and distorting, until it finally snapped back into the familiar, twisted version of the golfer. The eyes that locked onto Jason's were no longer human. They were black pits, hollow and endless, sucking in the light. You see, the golfer continued, his voice deepening with every word. The course feeds on those who play. It doesn't just take your life. It takes everything. Your past, your future, your memories, all of it becomes a part of this place. You will walk the fairways day after day and play the game again and again, never truly winning, never truly losing. And with each cycle, you will forget who you were until there is nothing left but the game. Jason staggered back, his hands gripping his head as if to steady himself. No, he thought desperately. This can't be happening. It can't. He tried to run, but his legs refused to obey, the pull of the course too strong. Each direction he turned, the fog seemed to grow thicker, closing in on him like a trap. There was no way out. He spun around looking for an escape, but all he saw was the endless stretch of the fairway, the dim outlines of the trees and bunkers, all now twisted and disfigured like a nightmarish version of the course he had once known. The hole behind him seemed to mock him now, a dark, gaping mouth that promised only one thing, the never-ending game. He was no longer a player. He was part of the course, and that truth hit him like a ton of bricks. There was no victory here, no ending to the game. There was only the eternal fairway, stretching out endlessly, with no way back. The golfer's voice echoed in the fog, cold and final. You've made your stroke. Now you'll walk forever with the others. The game continues, and you are its newest player. The words faded into the swirling fog, but their meaning lingered deep in Jason's chest, like a weight he could never escape. The course had him now, and it would never let go. Jason's mind felt as though it were collapsing in on itself, and yet the fog around him thickened, each breath becoming more difficult, as if the air itself was conspiring against him. He had heard the golfer's words, the warning, the finality in them. But what truly terrified him now was the vastness of the course, the sense of timelessness that hung over everything. It was as if the very ground beneath him had no beginning or end. The fairways stretched endlessly, disappearing into the dense fog. In every direction, the trees were twisted, gnarled, and dark, their branches twisting like claws in search of prey. Jason's eyes darted, desperate for any sign of escape, but all he saw were echoes of the same nightmare. A course that had once been a place of leisure, now a prison of horror. He was trapped here, bound by a force he could neither understand nor escape. The golfer's words were like an unshakable truth now. You are a player, one of many who has walked this course. Jason's heart raced as the implications sank in. He wasn't the first to be ensnared here. There were others, and they hadn't just disappeared. They had become part of the game. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and Jason staggered, almost falling as a low hum reverberated through the earth. It was subtle at first, but it grew louder, clearer, until it felt as though the very course was vibrating, as if it were alive, pulsing with an ancient energy. The fog parted momentarily, revealing a figure in the distance, a shape emerging from the mist like a mirage. Jason squinted, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the figure. It was a man, but not the golfer. This man wore a worn golf cap and a ragged polo shirt, his appearance disheveled as though he had been walking the course for a lifetime. And his eyes, they were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull the light from the air around them. Jason's legs moved involuntarily, and before he knew it, he was walking toward the figure, drawn by a force he could not resist. The figure didn't seem to acknowledge his approach. It just walked, slowly, methodically, like a man stuck in an eternal loop. The closer Jason got, the more he saw that this man was not merely walking the course. He was dragging his feet, his steps heavy as though weighed down by an unseen burden. There was a hollow emptiness about him, an air of resignation that seemed to permeate the very air. "Who are you?" Jason found himself asking, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The man didn't respond at first. He kept walking, his feet shuffling over the ground with a dull, rhythmic sound that seemed to sync with the hum of the earth beneath them. Then, with a slow, deliberate turn of his head, the man looked at Jason. His eyes were empty, like the black pits of a well. But in their depths, Jason thought he saw something, an echo of the man's former self, a glimpse of who he had once been before he was consumed by this place. "I was you," the man said, his voice raspy and hollow, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "I came here thinking it was just a game, but I was wrong. We all were." He paused, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the truth were too much to bear. "Once you're here, you don't leave. You just play and play until you forget who you were, until you become part of it. Like us?" Jason recoiled, the words chilling him to the bone. "Like us?" He looked around, his heart pounding in his chest. But the fog had parted just enough for him to see that the man wasn't alone. From the mist emerged more figures, others like him, their faces blank, their postures hunched in weariness. They wore the same ragged clothing, their eyes hollow, devoid of life. Jason took a step back, his mind reeling. These were the players who had come before him, each one trapped in the same endless cycle, each one doomed to wander this cursed course forever. One of the figures, a woman, shuffled toward Jason, her hands outstretched. Her lips moved, but her words were lost in the wind. She was speaking, but her voice was faint, like an echo from a distant memory. "Don't fight it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It takes everything, your life, your memories. It leaves nothing." Jason's chest tightened as the truth began to settle over him. The others who had walked this course, just like him, had become part of it, trapped in an endless loop of play. They were no longer individuals. They were fragments of the game, echoes of a time long past. His stomach twisted in horror as he realized that this wasn't a game that could be won. It wasn't about skill or luck. It was about endurance, how long one could survive before becoming just another lost player, doomed to walk the course forever. The figures began to move around him, each one following the same slow, ritualistic pace, their eyes vacant, their faces expressionless. They had all played the game, and now they were the game. Jason felt a surge of panic rise in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold numbness. He could see it now, the inevitability of it all. The course had no mercy. It didn't care about the players. It didn't care about the past. It just needed to feed, to consume, to trap. And once it had you, there was no escape. The hum of the earth grew louder, vibrating through Jason's very bones, and he felt himself being pulled into the rhythm, unable to resist. He took a step, then another, until he too was walking alongside the others. His steps were heavy, his body moving as though it were no longer his own. The course had claimed him, just as it had claimed all the others before him. And now, like them, he was part of the endless fairway, bound to play the game, to walk the course, until there was nothing left but the game itself. As he moved forward, Jason caught sight of something in the distance, a glimmer of light, a sliver of hope. But before he could focus on it, the fog thickened once again, obscuring everything in its path. There would be no escape, no victory. The game was eternal, and Jason was its newest player. And as the fog closed in around him, he could almost hear the echoes of the voices before him, whispering a single, chilling truth: "You will never leave." Jason's senses had dulled, a heaviness settling over his limbs as he trudged through the fog alongside the other players. The ground beneath him felt like it was shifting, and the once familiar feel of grass beneath his feet had morphed into something softer, more formless, like the very soil was consuming his footsteps. He tried to remember how he had come here, how he had stumbled upon the cursed course that now held him prisoner, but each attempt to grasp the details of his arrival was like trying to hold water in his hands. It slipped away, receding into the void, and with it his memories seemed to scatter like dead leaves in the wind. The others, the lost players who walked beside him, continued their silent march, their faces devoid of expression. They did not speak, did not acknowledge each other, only moved forward, their bodies slumped with the weight of a reality they had long accepted. Jason's heart twisted as he watched them. These were people who had once been like him, individuals with lives and hopes, but now they were nothing more than shadows, trapped in the same cycle, lost to the game. The mist, dense and oppressive, hung in the air, stifling and cold. The landscape around him was eerily quiet, as if time itself had stopped. The trees, once tall and proud, now appeared as twisted, rotting husks of their former selves. The fairways stretched on endlessly, leading to nowhere, and the holes that dotted the course had become nothing more than dark voids, like mouths waiting to consume anyone who dared approach them. Each step Jason took seemed to carry him farther from reality, farther from the world he had known. The golfer's words echoed in his mind. The game doesn't just take your life, it takes your memories. It consumes everything. Jason could feel it now, that loss of self, that erosion of who he had been. His name, his past, his identity, everything was fading like a dream upon waking. He tried to focus on the small details of his life, the things he had once cherished, but they were slipping away faster than he could hold on to them. Faces blurred, events became unclear, and soon, he couldn't remember why he had even cared. It was all irrelevant now. He turned to the woman walking beside him, the same one who had spoken to him earlier, her voice a faint whisper in his memory. Her face was as empty as the others, but there was something about her posture, something in the way she walked, that suggested she had once been someone he could talk to. He had to ask, had she remembered? He had to know if there was any chance of salvation, of breaking free. "Do you remember who you were?" Jason asked, his voice quiet, barely more than a rasp. The woman did not respond at first, her steps never faltering as she walked beside him. For a moment, Jason thought she hadn't heard him, that she was as lost as the rest. But then her voice came, distant and hollow. "I was someone," she said, her words almost lost to the wind. "I was someone before the course took me. I was a wife, a mother. But now I don't even know my own name anymore." Jason's heart sank. A wife? A mother? Her words struck him like a blow. How had she become this? How had she lost everything, her name, her identity, her very essence? Just like that. His stomach turned at the thought. How many others were like her? Walking the course, their memories consumed, their pasts erased by the game. How many had started like him, hopeful, ready to play, and ended up just like the others, empty shells trapped in a never-ending cycle. They continued walking, their steps synchronized, a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the course itself was watching them, its very ground alive with the knowledge of their fate. He began to understand what the golfer had meant when he said they would become part of it. The course didn't just take their lives. It took their essence, their memories, and their identities, leaving only a hollowed-out shell behind. As they passed another hole, Jason's eyes were drawn to the dark void within it. The hole no longer looked like a hole. It looked like a gateway, a passage to somewhere else, somewhere beyond the course. He didn't know why, but something inside him urged him to step forward, to enter the hole. There was no logic to it, no reason to believe that stepping into the hole would be any different from what he had already experienced, but it felt like the only option, the only escape. He reached out, his hand trembling, but before he could step forward, the woman beside him spoke again, her voice trembling with a sadness that was almost unbearable. "Don't," she whispered. "The holes, they don't take you to freedom. They just take you deeper. They send you to places you can't even imagine, things you don't want to remember." Jason's heart stilled, and he withdrew his hand from the hole, his mind racing. She was right. The hole wasn't an escape. It was a trap, just like everything else on this cursed course. It was just another part of the game, a place where memories were swallowed whole, where time lost all meaning, where the self was erased. He tried to process what he was feeling, tried to hold on to his last thread of consciousness. But the weight of it all was too much. The fog thickened again, pressing in around him, drowning his thoughts. He could feel the pull of the course once more, a deep, gnawing hunger in the earth beneath his feet. The game was claiming him, erasing him bit by bit. His memories were slipping away, and soon there would be nothing left. He turned his gaze back to the others, the lost players, their faces blank, their eyes empty. Were they aware of their fate? Did they remember the lives they had once led, or had they long ago succumbed to the course's hunger? And what would become of him? Would he too fade into oblivion, his past lost to the fog, his name forgotten, until all that remained was another lost soul, walking the endless fairways, unable to remember who he had been? Jason took another step, his mind weighed down by the crushing inevitability of it all. He wasn't just walking the course anymore. He was becoming part of it, another forgotten memory, another lost player. And with each passing step, the man he had been faded further into the distance, swallowed by the fog, leaving only a shadow behind. The course had claimed him, and there was no going back. Jason's footsteps had grown heavier with each passing moment, each one echoing through the silence of the course like the beat of a funeral drum. The fog around him swirled, thick and suffocating, but as he walked, he couldn't shake the sense that the ground beneath him was shifting. The fairway seemed to stretch farther with every step, as though it had no end. It was as if the very course itself was alive, aware of his movements, watching him with an unseen eye, pulling him deeper into its clutches. He couldn't remember how long he had been walking, or even why. The passage of time had become irrelevant in this place. His mind felt disconnected from reality, a distant observer to his own actions. He tried to focus on the faint memories that still lingered at the edges of his consciousness, but they slipped away like water through his fingers. His name, his life before the course, everything was fading, becoming more distant with each passing moment. The more he tried to grasp it, the more it eluded him. The faces of the other players were like empty masks, their expressions devoid of anything human. They walked in unison, a procession of lost souls, each one trapped in their own endless loop, bound to the course for eternity. Jason glanced at the woman who had spoken to him earlier, but her eyes had lost the faint glimmer of recognition they once held. Now, they were just as empty as the others, hollow, devoid of life. She had become a part of the course, a mere shadow of her former self. The deeper Jason ventured into the fog, the more oppressive the air became. He could feel the weight of the course pressing down on him, as though it were forcing him to forget who he was, to become just another player in its endless game. His thoughts were sluggish, clouded, and he found it increasingly difficult to focus. The fog twisted and writhed, and the fairway before him seemed to shift, taking on a life of its own. Suddenly, the fog parted just enough for Jason to see something ahead. A faint glimmer of light, as though the sun were breaking through the clouds, illuminated a distant figure. At first, he thought it was another player, but as he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a hole, one of the course's infamous holes, but this one was different. It was bigger, darker, and as he gazed into it, he could see something deep within, something that stirred. Jason's heart raced, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He knew instinctively that this was not just any hole. It was the first hole, the one where everything had begun, the one that had swallowed up countless players before him, dragging them into its abyss. He had heard the whispers of it from the others, but now he could see it with his own eyes. It was not a hole in the ground, but a doorway, a passage into the heart of the course itself, where the game began and where it would ultimately end. The figures around him seemed to fade into the background as he approached the hole. His legs moved on their own, pulled by an unseen force, each step taking him closer to the darkness within. He felt as though he were being drawn into the very heart of the course, the source of its power, its hunger. The others, the lost players, continued their march, unaware of his approach, their minds consumed by the game. They were no longer individuals. They were part of the course, as much a fixture of the landscape as the twisted trees and rotting fairways. As Jason stood at the edge of the hole, he felt a cold draft rise from within, carrying with it a scent of earth and decay. It was as if the hole itself was alive, breathing, waiting for him to make the final step. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind screamed at him to turn away, to resist the pull, but he couldn't. It was too powerful, too consuming. The course had him in its grip, and there was no escaping. He leaned closer, drawn by the strange energy that emanated from the hole. He could see something deep within it, faint shapes, shadows that moved and shifted, as though they were waiting for him. The darkness seemed to call to him, to promise something he couldn't quite understand. It was a promise of release, of escape, but at the same time, it was a warning. The hole wasn't just an exit. It was a trap, a place where memories were swallowed, where identities were erased. Jason's body trembled as he stared into the abyss. He could feel the weight of it, feel it pulling him in. It was as though the course itself was offering him a choice: to step into the hole and become one with the game, or to remain in this never-ending cycle of walking the fairways, endlessly searching for something he would never find. The very essence of the game was here, in this hole, and Jason understood in that moment that there was no way out. The fog closed in around him again, thick and suffocating, and he found himself retreating from the hole, his legs moving of their own accord. It was as though the course had rejected him, as though it had sensed his hesitation. He couldn't be sure, but something about the hole felt wrong. More than just a passage, more than just a way out. It was a beginning and an end, a place where players went to be erased, to become part of the course's eternal cycle. Jason looked around at the players still walking beside him. Their faces were expressionless, their bodies hollow, but in the depths of his mind, he knew the truth. They were not just victims, they were the course. They were the ones who had crossed the first hole, had passed through its darkness, and now they were trapped, forever walking the fairways, endlessly playing the game. He understood now. There was no escape. The course claimed all who entered, and in the end, it didn't matter how far you walked or how long you played. The game would always find a way to erase you. And as he took another step, Jason felt it. The game had already begun to claim him, its grip tightening around his soul. The course was alive, and he was becoming part of it. Every step he took, every breath he drew was a part of the game, and there was no turning back. The first hole had not just been a beginning. It had been the first step toward losing himself, toward becoming another lost soul, another echo in the course's endless cycle. Jason continued to walk, the fairway stretching before him, endless and unyielding. The hole was behind him now, but its darkness lingered in his mind, a shadow he could not escape. And so, he walked like all the others before him, his memories fading, his identity slipping away, until there was nothing left but the game. And in that moment, he understood that it wasn't the course that had trapped him. It was his own mind, his own fear, and his own desire to escape. The game was within him now, and there was no place for him to run. Jason's steps grew even heavier, and his mind continued to reel from the encounter with the first hole. The course, with its fog and shifting fairways, felt more like an extension of his consciousness than a mere landscape. His body seemed to be walking, but his mind was somewhere far away, trapped in an endless loop of thought. The faces of the players, their hollow eyes and soulless expressions, were no longer distinguishable as individuals. They were mere shadows, an amalgamation of lost spirits that had long ago been absorbed into the course's never-ending cycle. He tried to recall the world before this place. There had been a time when he had felt something emotions, a sense of purpose. He had lived for something more than just the repetitive rhythm of his footsteps on the fairway. But now, those memories seemed as distant as the sun in the sky. Each passing moment, each endless step, chipped away at whatever remained of his former self. The fog thickened again, the pressure building, squeezing the last vestiges of his identity into the farthest corners of his mind. It was then that he saw the green ahead, a patch of lush grass, vibrant against the dull backdrop of the course. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he dared to hope. The green was a sign, wasn't it? A symbol of life, of something familiar. It felt like the last vestige of the world he knew, a place that might offer him a reprieve from the endless game. But as he drew closer, doubt began to creep into his mind once more. The closer he got, the more the green began to shift, becoming something darker, something less inviting. Jason hesitated at the edge of the green, the ground beneath his feet feeling softer, as if it were yielding to him, encouraging him to step forward. His instinct screamed at him to run, to turn back, but something within him resisted. He was too far gone now, too deep into the course to turn back. The green whispered to him, beckoning him closer. What was the purpose of the course if not to play the game? What was left for him if he refused to follow its rules? With a final, almost reluctant step, Jason crossed onto the green. The ground beneath him felt strange, not quite solid, as if it were an illusion. He could feel it shifting beneath his weight, molding to his every movement, responding to him. The sound of his footsteps seemed to echo, amplified, as though the ground was trying to capture the rhythm of his journey. It was as though the course itself was breathing beneath him, alive with some strange, hidden force that he could neither see nor understand. But there was no denying the sense of dread that filled him. This wasn't the world he had known. The green wasn't just a patch of grass. It was a living, breathing thing, connected to the very heart of the course. It was an invitation, not to freedom, but to deeper entanglement within the game. The game was not a set of rules to be followed. It was a trap, a cyclical existence where each step forward was merely another layer of the same endless journey. And yet, as Jason stood there, his gaze fixed on the green, he found himself unable to look away. It was so familiar, so real, and yet so utterly alien. He felt a strange pull, an irresistible urge to sink into it, to allow himself to become one with the course. The faces of the players who had walked alongside him seemed to vanish in the distance, as if the course had claimed them, erasing them from his memory. They were gone, but Jason felt himself tethered to them by something unseen, something intangible. He knelt down, running his fingers through the grass. The sensation was strangely comforting, almost as if the green was offering him solace, an escape from the confusion that gripped his mind. But beneath that comfort, a warning pulsed through him. Something was wrong. The green wasn't a sanctuary. It was part of the trap, part of the course's hold on him. The deeper he sank into it, the further he would be from ever finding the way out. It was then that he heard it, the sound of a distant whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the very ground beneath him, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was familiar, but Jason couldn't place it. The voice called his name, and though he wanted to resist, wanted to run from the sound, he felt himself drawn closer to it. The whisper was like a thread pulling at the very fabric of his being, unraveling him slowly, piece by piece. Jason rose to his feet, the whisper growing louder, more insistent. He turned, half expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was no one. The green seemed to stretch on forever, like a landscape that had no beginning and no end. The voice called to him again, louder now, as if it were reaching out from the depths of the course itself. It wasn't the voice of a player, not the voice of someone lost like him. No, this was something else, something far older, more sinister, that had always been part of the course. The ground beneath him seemed to ripple, as though something was moving beneath the surface. The green, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt as though it were closing in on him, like a trap. The voices, whispers and murmurs, grew louder, until they surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. They weren't just calling his name now. They were calling all the players' names, every soul that had walked these fairways and had been consumed by the course. Jason realized with a cold, sinking feeling that he was not alone here. The course was full of echoes, full of the spirits of those who had been lost before him. In that moment, it became clear to him the green wasn't a place to find freedom. It was a place where the course fed on memories, where it devoured the very essence of who you were. The green was not life, but a prison, an eternal resting place for the lost, a final stop before the course erased everything about you. There would be no escape. Jason understood now that the course didn't want him to find the end. It wanted him to stay, to become part of the never-ending cycle. And the longer he resisted, the more it would claim of him. The green was no longer a symbol of hope. It was the embodiment of the course itself, pulling him deeper into its game. As the whispers surrounded him, Jason knew one thing for certain. The course had him now, and there would be no leaving it. Jason's body felt heavy, as though the weight of the course was pressing down on him from all sides. The whispers around him never ceased, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. He could no longer discern whether they came from the ground beneath his feet or from the very air surrounding him, as if the entire world had become one massive entity calling out to him. He had once believed that he might be able to escape, that there was some way out of the course's grip. But now, standing at the edge of the green, he understood with a terrifying clarity that there was no way out. And yet, despite the overwhelming sense of dread, Jason's mind refused to give up hope entirely. Maybe there was still a way to outsmart the course. Perhaps there was something within it, a loophole, a hidden escape that could break the cycle. He thought back to the players he had encountered, the ones with hollow eyes and empty faces. Had they given up? Had they resigned themselves to their fate? Or had they simply been swallowed whole, without ever realizing what was happening to them? Jason's thoughts were interrupted when his gaze fell upon a bunker not far from the green. Unlike the rest of the course, which seemed to pulse with life, the bunker stood still and silent, an ominous presence amid the unsettling chaos of the fairway. It was a stark contrast to the smooth, manicured surfaces of the course, its edges jagged and uneven, as if it had been worn down by time or some force beyond comprehension. The sand inside was dark, almost black, and it shimmered in a way that unsettled Jason further, like it was more than just ordinary sand. Something about the bunker called to him. He felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, as if the ground itself was guiding him toward its depths. Despite the fear gnawing at him, he found himself walking toward it, his feet moving of their own accord. The whispers grew louder as he neared, becoming a cacophony of voices that drowned out all other sound. He couldn't understand the words. They were too distorted, too fragmented. But they felt important, as if they held the key to something he desperately needed to understand. As he reached the edge of the bunker, Jason hesitated. The darkness within it seemed to swallow the light, and he could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest. There was something wrong about it, something unnatural. Yet, there was also a strange sense of calm. The voices, which had been growing more frantic, seemed to quiet as he stood there, as though the bunker itself had absorbed their energy, leaving him in a hollow, unnerving silence. Against his better judgment, Jason stepped forward, lowering himself into the bunker. The sand was cool to the touch, and it shifted beneath his weight like liquid. With each step he took, he felt the ground giving way slightly, as though it were made of something far more insidious than sand. As he sank deeper, he noticed something odd about the air. It was thick, almost oppressive, and had a scent he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the smell of earth or grass or anything familiar. It was something older, more ancient, as though it had been buried here for centuries. In the center of the bunker, Jason found a large, flat stone. It was smooth, almost polished, with strange markings etched into its surface. The symbols seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were alive, shifting in the dim light. Jason reached out instinctively, his fingers tracing the carvings, feeling a strange energy emanating from the stone. He couldn't explain it, but he had the distinct sensation that the stone held answers. Answers about the course, about what had happened to the other players, and about his own fate. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder than ever before. They no longer seemed fragmented, but coherent, speaking directly to him. He could hear his name being called, but it was distorted, twisted into something unrecognizable. And then, amidst the cacophony, a single, clear voice broke through. It was a voice he knew, one he had heard before, but not in this place. "Jason," the voice whispered, but it wasn't a whisper. It was clear, sharp, like a bell ringing in the dead of night. "You should not have come here." Jason's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was his own. But how could that be? He was standing alone in the bunker, surrounded by darkness and sand. No one else was there. The voice was coming from within him, but at the same time, it felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else, someone who had been lost to the course long ago. The voice continued, growing more insistent, more desperate. "This place is not what you think it is. You have only begun to see the truth. If you go deeper, you will lose yourself forever. The course will claim you, just as it claimed all the others before you. There is no escape." Jason's mind reeled as the truth began to sink in. This bunker, this place, was not just a physical feature of the course. It was a part of its web, a trap designed to ensnare those who dared to venture too far into its mysteries. The course was not just a game. It was a living entity, feeding on the souls of its players, trapping them in an endless cycle of despair. And the bunker, with its dark sand and pulsing stone, was its heart. For a moment, Jason felt paralyzed, as if the ground beneath him had frozen. He wanted to turn back, to escape, but he knew it was too late. The course had already claimed him, and there was no leaving. He could feel the weight of the stone pressing against his fingertips, as if it were drawing him in, binding him to the course forever. He had entered the bunker looking for answers, but all he had found was the truth of his own entrapment. The whispers grew louder once more, merging into a single, unified voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the course. "You are part of the game now," the voice said, a tone of finality settling over it. "There is no end. There is no escape. There is only the game." As Jason stood there, surrounded by the dark sand and the endless whispers, he understood that the course was not just a place. It was a prison, and the bunker was its deepest, most sinister cell. He was not a player here. He was a prisoner, bound to the game for eternity. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed out of the bunker, the weight of the realization still hanging over him like a thick fog. The stone beneath his fingers felt colder now, its markings more alien and incomprehensible. The sand around him shifted again, as if the very earth was alive, reacting to his retreat. He felt the pull of the course grow stronger, as though it were reasserting its claim over him. But now, more than ever, Jason was determined not to succumb to it. He had to find a way out, even if it meant unraveling the very fabric of this place. He scrambled out of the bunker, his legs shaky, and stumbled back onto the fairway. The whispers, which had once been distant, were now an omnipresent hum in his ears, a constant reminder of the course's hold on him. The ground beneath his feet felt different now, as if it were rejecting him, pushing him away. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the weight of the entire course was pressing down on him. Despite the pressure building around him, Jason refused to stop. He knew he had to move forward. But where? The course stretched on endlessly, with no sign of an end. The green he had been drawn to earlier now felt like a distant memory, its allure fading with each passing second. The fairway ahead of him was unclear, its path twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. It was as though the course itself had no true form, no real structure, only an illusion designed to confuse and entrap its players. It was then that he noticed something strange ahead, an opening in the distance, a darkened path that seemed to beckon him. It was not a part of the fairway, nor was it a familiar feature of the course. The darkness seemed to call to him, drawing him in with a strange, magnetic pull. His instincts screamed at him to turn away, but something inside him, some primal urge, urged him toward it. As he neared the opening, the whispers quieted for a moment, leaving only the sound of his own breathing. The air was thick with tension, as though something was waiting for him on the other side. He hesitated at the threshold, unsure of what lay beyond. But the pull was undeniable, and with a sense of grim resolve, Jason stepped forward, crossing into the darkness. The moment he passed the threshold, the world seemed to shift. The fairway disappeared, replaced by a vast, empty space that stretched on in every direction. There were no trees, no sand traps, no greens. Only an endless, black void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. In the center of the space stood a single, unmarked hole, its dimensions unclear, but its presence undeniable. It was as though the hole had always been there, waiting for him. Jason moved toward it, drawn by an overwhelming compulsion he couldn't explain. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very act of walking was becoming a struggle. The closer he got to the hole, the more he could feel the weight of the course pressing in on him, like a suffocating presence. It was as if the hole itself was a focal point, a nexus that held the course together, and Jason was about to become part of it. As he stood at the edge of the hole, Jason's mind began to unravel. The voices, once scattered and disjointed, were now clear and distinct, filling his mind with a sense of dread and inevitability. They were not speaking to him anymore. They were speaking through him. He could hear the words, fragments of memories and thoughts that were not his own. He heard names, places, moments from his past that felt distant and faded, as though they belonged to someone else. It was as though the hole was drawing these echoes from the depths of his consciousness, forcing him to relive them. In that moment, Jason realized that the hole was not just a physical space. It was a reflection of his own mind, a void that had consumed all his memories, all his desires. The course had not just taken his body, it had taken his identity, his very sense of self. The hole was not an escape, but an extension of the course, a place where the echoes of all its lost players were trapped, their memories scattered and their lives erased. A cold chill ran down Jason's spine as the voices grew louder, becoming a cacophony of despair and regret. They were the voices of the lost, the voices of those who had come before him, all trapped in the same cycle, all drawn into the hole like moths to a flame. Jason could feel their presence, their eyes upon him, as if they were waiting for him to join them. But Jason could not. He would not. Despite the crushing weight of the course, despite the pull of the hole, he refused to surrender. He took a deep breath and stepped back, away from the hole. For a moment, the voices quieted, and the air felt less oppressive. The darkness receded slightly, as if the course was momentarily retreating. Yet, even as he stepped away, the realization hit him with the force of a lightning bolt. There was no true escape. The hole was not just a physical entity. It was part of the course's design, an inescapable loop that would continue to draw players in, offering them false hope and eventual despair. The course had a rhythm, a pattern, and Jason was a part of it now, whether he wanted to be or not. He had thought that he could outsmart the course, that he could find a way to break free from its grasp. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the course was not something to be defeated. It was something that had to be lived through over and over again, as part of an eternal cycle. And as much as Jason resisted, as much as he fought against it, he was now part of that cycle. There was no end, no escape, no redemption, only the game. As Jason stood there, alone in the darkness, he understood that the hole was not the end of his journey, but a new beginning, a fresh chapter in the never-ending story of the course. The echoes of the lost players would continue, their voices blending with his own, until he too became a part of the void, a part of the course's unbroken cycle. Jason felt a tremor deep within him as he stood at the edge of the hole, its yawning darkness now replaced with an eerie stillness. He had pulled back, yes, but a part of him wondered whether he had made the right choice. The whispers, those voices that once seemed to echo from all corners of the course, had quieted. But the silence that had replaced them was no comfort. In fact, it was worse. an unnatural quiet that pressed against his ears, suffocating and oppressive. Jason knew that the course was watching him, waiting for him to make his next move. For a moment, he stood motionless, considering the path he had just taken. The echoes, the voices of the lost players, still rang in his head, their fragmented memories swirling like a storm in his mind. He could no longer differentiate between his own thoughts and theirs. Was he becoming them? Had the course already begun its work on him, turning him into one of the mindless, hollow beings who roamed its twisted fairways? The thought unsettled him, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had no time to dwell on it. What mattered now was finding a way out, or at least a way to understand this place. The hole, the bunker, and the whispers, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle, one that he had yet to fully grasp. The only thing that was certain was that the course was not just a game. It was something far older, far more insidious, and Jason was caught in its web. Turning away from the hole, Jason took a tentative step back onto the fairway. The grass beneath his feet was soft and green, an oddly comforting sight in the midst of everything that had happened. But as his gaze swept across the course, a new realization struck him. The fairway before him was no longer the same. It seemed to stretch on in impossible directions, the once familiar landmarks now disjointed and fractured. The trees, once neatly lined along the edges of the course, now twisted and warped, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like twisted hands. The sand traps had become vast chasms, yawning like open mouths, waiting to devour anything that came too close. Jason swallowed hard, his breath quickening. He was no longer sure where he was. The course, it seemed, was shifting, changing in response to his presence. He was caught in its flow, moving through its ever-changing maze, and there was no telling where the path would lead. The once smooth, predictable layout of the golf course had become a living, breathing nightmare. As he walked, the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the very earth was alive. It was subtle at first, a faint vibration that he could feel through the soles of his shoes, but soon it grew stronger, almost imperceptible. It was as though the course itself was sending out signals, beckoning him forward, urging him to continue. He had the distinct sense that the course was guiding him. But where? To a new trap? To another part of the puzzle? Or was it something more sinister? Jason pushed forward, trying to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that clung to him. The fairway stretched out before him, the edges blurred by the growing fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. He felt an unsettling chill in the air, and for the first time, he noticed the faint shapes of figures in the distance, shadowy, indistinct forms that moved just beyond the reach of his vision. They were not people, but something else, something that resembled people in the most unsettling way, like half-formed ghosts caught between worlds. They did not seem to notice him at first, but as he moved closer, their shapes became more defined. They were not walking, but rather drifting, gliding along the edges of the course, their eyes fixed on something Jason could not see. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though they were following a rhythm that only they understood. Jason's heart began to race again as he realized that these figures were not lost players. They were the course's true inhabitants, its sentient force. They were not bound by the rules of the game, but rather by the will of the course itself. He watched in growing horror as one of the figures turned toward him. It was tall, thin, and pale, its face obscured by a hood. The figure moved with an eerie grace, its steps soundless against the grass. As it came closer, Jason felt an overwhelming pull, an unnatural compulsion to follow it, to step into its world. His body was no longer under his control. His feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the figure with an almost magnetic force. Before he could react, the figure raised a hand, and Jason froze. His breath caught in his throat as the figure spoke, its voice soft but clear, cutting through the oppressive silence. "You do not belong here," it said, its words reverberating in Jason's mind. "But you will in time." The voice sent a jolt of fear through Jason, and for the first time, he felt truly afraid, not just of the course, but of the figure itself. It was as though it had seen through him, seen into his very soul. And in that moment, Jason realized the terrifying truth. The course was not just a place of physical entrapment. It was a place of spiritual consumption. The fairway, the holes, the bunkers, all of it was designed to strip away everything that made a person who they were. It was a place of transformation, where players became something else entirely. Jason staggered backward, his mind racing. The figure's gaze never wavered, its eyes hidden beneath the hood, but Jason could feel the weight of its stare. It was waiting, watching, expecting him to give in. But Jason had come this far. He couldn't let the course take him. Not like this. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the overwhelming presence of the figure. "I won't stay," he whispered, more to himself than to the figure. "I won't become one of you." The figure's lips twisted into a semblance of a smile, but it was cold, empty. "You have no choice," it said. "The game has already begun, and you're already part of it." As Jason turned and fled, he could feel the course shifting around him, its grip tightening. The fairway stretched on forever, but the way forward was obscured, clouded by the ever-deepening fog and the whispers of the lost. The figure's words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder that there was no escape, only the game. Jason's mind raced as he stumbled away from the spectral figure, its words echoing in his ears like a dark prophecy. He had always believed that life was a series of choices, that every path was defined by the decisions he made. But now, as he wandered deeper into the course, he realized that those choices might not matter at all. In this place, it felt as though every step had been preordained, every direction guided by an invisible force that he had no power to resist. The fairway stretched before him, its boundaries now completely obscured by a thick, unnatural fog that seemed to grow denser the longer he walked. His footsteps felt muffled, swallowed by the eerie silence that surrounded him. The occasional whisper would rise and fall, but it was hard to tell where it came from or whether it was real at all. The wind, once gentle, now carried an unsettling chill, pressing in on him from all sides. The trees, if they could still be called that, had begun to shift and blur, their trunks bending and twisting like writhing creatures, their branches stretching toward the sky in jagged, impossible angles. It was as though the very essence of the course had changed. The familiar sense of order that he had first encountered when arriving, rows of neatly trimmed fairways, manicured greens, and carefully placed sand traps, was gone. In its place was a chaotic, living entity, constantly shifting and warping around him. The course, once a place of leisure and routine, had become a twisted reflection of itself, a place where time no longer followed the normal rules. Every corner he turned revealed a new distortion, a new horror waiting to be discovered. Jason's eyes were drawn to the green in the distance, barely visible through the thickening fog. It was the only part of the course that remained familiar, its bright expanse of grass gleaming through the gloom. He felt an inexplicable pull toward it, a sense of urgency that he could not explain. The green was calling him, drawing him closer, and he had to know why. Maybe there, among the scattered remnants of the fairway, he would find some clue, some way to escape. But as he moved toward the green, the sense of unease grew. It was as though the ground beneath his feet was shifting with every step he took. The fairway, once solid and dependable, now seemed like a cruel trick, a never-ending path leading nowhere. His legs grew heavier, as if the very soil was trying to pull him back to keep him from reaching the green. The farther he went, the more distant the green appeared, as though it was receding into another dimension, unreachable, mocking his every effort. It was then that Jason realized something that made his stomach churn. The green wasn't moving away from him at all. It was moving toward him, an optical illusion that tricked the mind into thinking he was moving forward when, in fact, he was going in circles. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but the green remained tantalizingly out of reach, always just beyond his grasp. A deep sense of dread settled in his chest, and he felt an overwhelming urge to turn around, to run, to escape. But the fog, the twisted fairway, and the warped landscape made it impossible to see any path other than the one he was already on. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence, a sharp, unnatural crack that echoed through the air, followed by a soft, rustling whisper that was neither wind nor voice. Jason froze, his heart racing. The sound came again, louder this time, as if something was moving just beyond the mist. He strained his eyes, trying to make out any shapes or figures, but the fog was impenetrable, swallowing everything around him. All he could hear now was the eerie rustling and the unmistakable feeling that he was no longer alone on the course. It was then that he saw it, a figure, barely visible through the mist, standing at the edge of the green. Its shape was indistinct, blurry, but there was something undeniably human about it. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was not moving. It simply stood there, facing away from him, as if waiting for him to approach. He could feel the pull of its presence drawing him in, urging him toward it. His body moved before his mind could catch up, his feet carrying him forward against his will. With each step, the figure became clearer, more defined, but its details were still obscured by the mist. Jason tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat, trapped by the heavy air. He had to reach it. He had to know what it wanted. The figure, however, remained silent, unmoving, like a shadow in the distance. When he finally reached the green, he stood just a few feet from the figure. Its face was still hidden from view, but there was something strangely familiar about it, something that set his nerves on edge. He reached out, hesitant but compelled, and touched the figure's shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, the world around him seemed to shudder. The fog swirled violently, and the course trembled as though it were alive, reacting to his presence. Suddenly, the figure turned, its face coming into focus, and Jason recoiled in shock. It was him. The same eyes, the same face, the same expression of confusion and fear. But this version of himself was different, hollow, empty, as though something vital had been drained away. The figure's lips moved, and for the first time, Jason heard its voice, a soft, eerie whisper that seemed to resonate with the very core of his being. "You're too late," it said, its voice trembling. "The course already owns you." Jason stumbled back, his mind spinning as the realization hit him with full force. This was not just a place of entrapment for his body. It was a prison for his soul, a twisted dimension where time and identity lost all meaning. The course was not just playing a game with him. It was erasing him, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the hollow echo of who he had once been. With a sharp intake of breath, Jason turned away from the figure, but the green around him began to blur again. The fairway stretched out before him, and he realized with growing horror that the course was not just a maze. It was a cycle. The same steps, the same mistakes, the same choices would continue to repeat themselves, trapping him in a never-ending loop of fractured time and identity. There was no way out. The course had already claimed him, and nothing he did would change that. The green, once a symbol of hope, now stood as a reminder of his own helplessness. And all Jason could do was walk deeper into the fog, deeper into the course's embrace. Jason's footsteps were heavy now, each one a dull thud against the distorted, shifting ground beneath him. The fog had thickened to a point where even the faintest hint of light seemed distant and unreachable, swallowed by the oppressive haze. It was as though the very air had turned against him, weighing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. He tried to shake off the image of his own reflection in the green, the hollow, lifeless version of himself staring back at him. But the more he tried to forget, the clearer it became. The course, this place, wasn't just distorting reality. It was rewriting his existence, erasing the essence of who he was. His mind scrambled for answers. What had he done to deserve this? What was the source of the evil that had taken root here? He couldn't tell how much time had passed since that moment on the green, nor could he even trust his own sense of time anymore. Every second felt stretched, distorted, as if the world around him was constantly changing shape, rebelling against any attempt to categorize it. Even his memories felt like fading whispers in the back of his mind, slipping away just as he tried to grasp them. For the first time, Jason felt completely and utterly alone. The figure, the hollow version of himself, was gone, swallowed by the same fog that had claimed everything else on this cursed course. No other sounds broke the silence, not even the faint rustling of leaves or the soft whisper of the wind. The trees, those twisted, gnarled shapes that had once reached for the sky, now looked like broken skeletal hands, desperately trying to claw their way back to a forgotten earth. Jason walked on, not knowing where he was going, not even sure if he could walk any longer. His body was heavy with exhaustion, and his mind was becoming less and less reliable. He was no longer certain what was real or just a figment of his delirium. The same sense of dread, that inescapable feeling that something unseen was watching, followed him relentlessly. And then, just when he thought he might collapse, he saw it. The clubhouse in the distance, a familiar shape rising from the fog like an oasis of sanity. He hurried toward it, driven by a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, there would be answers waiting for him there. As he approached, the door loomed larger, but something about it felt wrong. The walls were jagged, the windows cracked like broken teeth, and the building seemed to shift with every step he took. His heart pounded harder, his chest tightening as a cold sweat dripped down his face. He hesitated at the entrance, unsure whether stepping inside would bring him closer to salvation or plunge him deeper into the nightmare. With a shaky hand, Jason pushed open the door. The hinges creaked in protest, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the air thick with a stale, oppressive scent. At first glance, the space appeared to be abandoned, but as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he noticed the chairs, neatly arranged as though waiting for someone. The walls, covered in old photographs, seemed to whisper secrets, their cracked frames distorting the faces of the people in the pictures. But it wasn't the photographs that caught Jason's attention. It was the faint sound that echoed from deeper within the building. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone or something was pacing, waiting. Jason moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, each step an agonizing decision. The hallway beyond the main room was lined with doors, each one ajar, as though inviting him in, daring him to look closer. He was drawn to the end of the hallway, where a door stood slightly ajar, its dark silhouette casting a long shadow across the floor. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, each beat striking like a hammer against his skull. He had no choice but to move forward. When Jason pushed the door open, the room inside was completely dark. The tapping stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie silence. His breath quickened as his eyes strained to adjust to the blackness. But there was nothing. Nothing but an overwhelming sense of emptiness. It felt as though the room was infinite, stretching beyond the walls, beyond the course itself. And then, without warning, a faint light flickered in the far corner of the room. The light grew brighter, revealing a figure seated in the center of the room. It was the same figure he had seen earlier, the hollow, lifeless version of himself. Jason stumbled back, a sense of panic rising within him. This couldn't be happening again. This wasn't real. The figure, sitting motionless in the center of the room, began to speak in the same whispering tone, its voice now clear, almost too familiar. "Did you think you could escape?" Jason's body stiffened, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. He wanted to run, to leave this place behind, but his body refused to obey. He stood frozen, trapped in the same nightmare that had consumed him since the moment he had set foot on the course. The figure's eyes, dark, hollow, never left his. They pierced him, seeing through him, as if it knew all of his secrets, all of his regrets. "You're not the first," it said, its voice cold and devoid of emotion. "You're just another player in a game that never ends. This course takes everything, and once you've walked far enough, once you've lost enough of yourself, it will take you too. You'll become just like me, just like everyone who has ever wandered in, looking for a way out." Jason's pulse raced as the figure's words sunk in. This wasn't just a nightmare. It was a fate, an endless cycle of despair that had ensnared countless others. The course had already claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. But as he stared at the figure, he realized something else. Something was different now. He wasn't just a player in the game. He was the one who had awakened to it, the one who saw it for what it was. His heart pounded in his chest, but for the first time since arriving, he felt something else: anger. It surged within him, fueling a desire to break free, to refuse the course's hold over him. He wasn't just going to accept this. He wasn't going to let the course take him like it had taken so many before. With a sharp, defiant breath, Jason stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to confront the very thing that had been tormenting him all along. And then, the lights flickered once more, and the tapping started again, louder than before, as if the course itself was waking up to stop him. Jason's fight had only just begun. The room seemed to close in around Jason as the tapping grew louder, now reverberating through the walls, the floor, and even the air itself. It was no longer a mere sound. It was an insistent, unrelenting force, like a heartbeat that refused to be ignored. The flickering lights cast strange, elongated shadows that danced in time with the rhythm. Jason's legs wobbled beneath him, but his mind had latched onto one singular thought: escape. But the figure in front of him, the hollow, broken version of himself, had not moved. Its eyes, cold and unblinking, locked onto Jason's, as though daring him to step forward. In that moment, everything in Jason's world felt wrong. A distortion of reality that had begun to blur the boundaries between the physical and the supernatural. The fog outside, the cracked images on the walls, even the air around him, all of it seemed to mock him, pushing him toward the inevitability of the course's cruel game. Why do you keep running? The figure's voice rang out again, sharper now, more insistent, as if it was reading Jason's thoughts. There is no way out. The game will claim you as it has claimed the others. Jason's heart thundered in his chest, the words sinking into him like poison. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but his throat tightened, suffocated by a combination of fear and frustration. The sense of helplessness washed over him again, drowning out any fleeting hopes of freedom. The figure was right in one sense. He had been running from something he didn't fully understand. This course, this place, seemed beyond comprehension, a trap set long before his arrival. But Jason wasn't about to succumb to the same fate as those who had wandered in before him. No, he wasn't like them. He could feel the weight of his determination solidifying within him, a force greater than the fear. He took another step forward, this time with purpose. The figure didn't move, but as Jason approached, the light above him flickered one last time before cutting out completely. The sudden plunge into darkness was suffocating, as though the very essence of the world had been erased. Jason's senses swirled with the disorienting lack of vision. He could hear his own breath, shallow and rapid, and the rapid beating of his heart. But nothing else. No tapping, no whispers, no hum of the unseen presence that had been following him all along. Jason stood there in the void, trying to calm his racing thoughts, trying to make sense of his next move. Was this a trick? Was this the moment he had been waiting for, when the course would reveal its final move, swallowing him up in one last act of terror? Or was there something else, something hidden in the darkness, waiting for him to uncover it? And then, slowly, the tapping returned. It was quiet at first, almost tentative like a warning. But as the seconds ticked by, it grew louder, more frantic. Jason could feel it reverberating in his chest. Each tap a shockwave that seemed to rattle the very fabric of the world. He turned his head sharply, trying to locate its source, but the darkness around him remained impenetrable. The tapping continued, the rhythm now a distorted pattern, like something trying to communicate in a language he couldn't understand. Do you hear it? The voice came again, but this time it wasn't the hollow version of himself speaking. It was someone or something else. The tone was different, more fragmented, as though the entity was speaking through a veil. The game isn't over, Jason. You've only reached the final hole. And it is there, where everything will come to its true end. Jason's pulse quickened. The final hole? What did that mean? He had thought the worst was behind him, but it seemed that the course was far more insidious than he could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a game. It was a trial, an eternal loop, and he had stumbled into its heart. His thoughts raced. What could this final hole represent? A literal hole? A trap? A test of will? It didn't matter. He needed to reach it, confront it, and end this nightmare once and for all. With newfound resolve, Jason pushed through the suffocating darkness, feeling his way along the walls, desperate to find some clue, some path that would lead him to the end. The hallway stretched on, an endless expanse that seemed to shift and contort with each passing step. Jason felt the weight of his surroundings pushing in on him, as though the course itself was trying to swallow him whole. The sound of the tapping grew louder, now joined by another sound. Faint whispers, like a choir of distant voices, each one overlapping and indistinguishable from the others. The voices seemed to taunt him, mocking his every attempt to break free. And then, just as Jason thought he could go no further, he saw it. The light, faint at first, but growing stronger with every step. The door at the end of the hallway was cracked open, a sliver of light spilling into the void. His heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the moment. With a final surge of energy, Jason pushed the door open. What he saw on the other side was unlike anything he could have imagined. The room was vast, more like an endless cavern than a part of the clubhouse. The floor stretched out in all directions, but there were no walls. The horizon curved in a way that made it impossible to tell where the sky ended and the earth began. At the center of this surreal, otherworldly expanse stood a single object, an enormous, ornate golf tee, its shaft gleaming in the unnatural light, casting long shadows across the ground. And beneath the tee, in the center of its shadow, lay a hole. It wasn't just any hole. It was the deepest, darkest pit Jason had ever seen, its black depths and abyss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The tapping had stopped. The whispers had fallen silent. All that remained was the hole, waiting for him. Jason knew what he had to do. He stepped forward, his body moving almost against his will. His fate had led him here, and it was here, at this final hole, that he would either escape or be consumed by the course forever. He took a deep breath and jumped in. Jason fell. It wasn't a sharp drop, but a slow descent that stretched on far longer than he had expected. As he plummeted, the darkness around him seemed to shift and swirl like smoke. He had no sense of direction, no up or down, no way to know where the hole had taken him. His mind scrambled to make sense of the disorienting sensation, but it only deepened his confusion. What was this place? Was it real? Was he dead? Each thought was interrupted by another, each more frantic and desperate than the last. But all of them were met with a profound silence, a stillness so thick it seemed to choke the very air from his lungs. At first, the descent felt endless, like he was falling into some dark, forgotten crevice where time itself was suspended. His body tingled with a strange, static sensation, as though every nerve were being stretched out, pulled into another dimension. Jason's heart raced. The rational part of him screamed that he had made a mistake, that he had thrown himself into the unknown without fully understanding the consequences. But the voice of fear and doubt was drowned out by the overwhelming need to understand, to make sense of this nightmare that had consumed him. Suddenly, the fall ceased. Jason's body jerked to an abrupt stop, and he was thrown forward, landing with a thud on a soft, uneven surface. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to regain his bearings. Slowly, he pushed himself up, trembling, his hands brushing against the cool earth beneath him. The air was heavy here, thick with an oppressive weight that pressed against him from all sides. A muffled sound echoed from above, but he couldn't tell whether it was the distant echo of his fall or something else entirely. The void around him offered no clues, only the persistent feeling that he was not alone. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed a faint glow ahead. It was dim at first, but the more he focused, the clearer it became. It was a light, but not one that came from any recognizable source. It seemed to pulse, as though alive. Against his better judgment, Jason began to move toward it. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the ground beneath him was pulling at his feet, reluctant to let him go. The air grew colder as he neared the light, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken threat. The glow came from what looked like a stone archway, standing alone in the vast, unmarked terrain. It was carved with strange, intricate symbols that seemed to shift and change before his eyes, a constant movement that made Jason's head spin. His mind raced with questions, but one thought stood out above the rest. Had he just entered another world? Was this the final stage of the course? Or was it something more sinister? The very idea seemed impossible, but then again, nothing about this place made any sense. Jason stood before the archway, unsure of what to do next. The pulsing light drew him in, calling him to step closer, as if it were beckoning him to cross over. But something inside him hesitated. He had been led to this point by forces he didn't understand, forces that had toyed with him, manipulated him, and now, it seemed, were daring him to make the final move. He could feel the weight of their eyes upon him, the unspoken presence that had been watching from the moment he first set foot on the course. In the distance, he heard the faintest whisper, a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Welcome, Jason. You've done well to come this far." The words struck him with a jolt, as though they had been spoken directly into his mind. They were not just words. They were a command, a forceful pull that seemed to resonate deep within him. He couldn't tell if the voice was familiar, or if it was simply the manifestation of his own growing madness. But in that moment, something shifted. The weight of the course, the fear, the uncertainty, the darkness, began to feel less like an external force and more like a part of him. Perhaps he had been here before, or perhaps the course had always been within him. Maybe it wasn't just a place, but a state of mind. The realization hit Jason like a wave, crashing over him with the force of an awakening. He had never been in control. He had been playing a game all along, one in which the rules shifted with every step, one where the course itself had been steering him toward this final moment. His heart pounded as the truth sank in. This place, this endless loop, had been built to consume him, not just his body, but his very essence. He turned back, but the fall, the archway, the landscape, all of it had disappeared. He was standing in an empty void once again, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, yet it felt alien, disconnected from the reality he once knew. The air was thick with a strange, almost electric hum, a sound that vibrated in his bones. Then from the void, a figure began to materialize. It was a shadow at first, indistinct and shifting, but it slowly took form until it became a man, standing tall and imposing. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was an exact replica of himself, but twisted, corrupted. His eyes were hollow, his skin pale, and his face wore a smile that was both welcoming and mocking. "You've reached the end," the figure said, its voice echoing through Jason's mind. "But you already knew this wasn't real. You knew from the beginning that this was never a game. The hole you fell through was never meant to lead you anywhere. It was meant to bring you back. This is where it all begins, Jason. This is the final hole." Jason's body trembled as the full weight of those words sank in. This wasn't an escape. It was the end, the conclusion of a cycle that had no beginning and no end. His fight, his struggle, his fear, they had all been part of the same inevitable conclusion. The course had led him here, but there was nowhere left to go. Jason stood, frozen, before the figure that mirrored him, his twisted doppelganger who seemed to hold all the answers he had been desperately seeking. The figure's smile deepened, its hollow eyes staring into him as though it could see every secret he had buried deep within. Jason's heart raced. He felt the overwhelming weight of realization crushing him, as though the very air around him had thickened into a suffocating fog. This wasn't just the end of a physical journey. It was the end of something far more profound, something far darker. The realization was suffocating. For so long, Jason had believed he was playing a game, following a path laid out by some higher force, some inescapable design. But now he understood that it was never a game. It was never about winning or losing. The course, the maze, the twists and turns, the hidden dangers and false promises, had been a reflection of his own mind, a mirror showing him the infinite loops of his own psyche. This was not a place he had been led to. It was a place he had created, a manifestation of his own fear, confusion, and desire for control. "You're not real," Jason whispered, his voice shaking. "None of this is real." The figure laughed, a low, echoing sound that vibrated through the very core of Jason's being. "What is real, Jason? Is it the world you left behind? Or is it this place, where everything is exactly as you believe it to be? The truth is, this place is no different from you. It exists because you believe it does. And now, you believe it is the end. But I'm afraid you've only just begun." Jason's thoughts spiraled. The words, so simple and yet so profound, hung in the air like a heavy cloud. What did the figure mean by that? Had the course always been a metaphor, a distorted reflection of his own inner turmoil? Had he been so consumed by the search for answers that he had unknowingly trapped himself in a cycle of self-doubt and existential confusion? "No," Jason muttered, stepping back, shaking his head. This isn't real. It can't be. I'm not like you." The figure smiled again, its lips curling upward in a twisted parody of empathy. "Oh, but you are. We're the same, Jason. The same doubts, the same fears, the same desires. The difference is that I understand now. I understand that there is no escape. There is only the loop. There is only the course. You ran from it, and now you've returned to it." Jason staggered backward, his mind racing. His heart thudded in his chest, as though it were trying to break free. Could it be true? Had he really been running in circles all along? Had the course not been an external force, but a manifestation of his own struggle, his own self-imposed limitations? He glanced around the void, the emptiness stretching out in every direction, and realized something terrifying. There were no walls, no boundaries. This space wasn't like the labyrinth he had traversed before. It wasn't even like a room. It was infinite, endless, and yet it felt so small, so intimate, like his own mind had enclosed him here, trapping him in a prison he couldn't escape. The figure stepped closer, and Jason instinctively took a step back. But no matter how much he tried to distance himself, the figure remained there, looming in his peripheral vision like a shadow that would not be shaken. The voice that emanated from the figure wasn't just a sound. It was a pulse, a rhythm that echoed in Jason's chest. "You don't need to run anymore," the figure said, its voice soft and insistent. "You've been here all along. The course, the game, the maze, the traps, those were never real. They were just illusions. The truth is, you've always been here. This is where you belong." Jason's mind reeled. The weight of those words felt like a blow to the head, disorienting him. "No, that can't be true," he said through clenched teeth. "I'm not like you. I'm not some twisted version of myself." The figure's smile softened, almost with pity. "Ah, but you are Jason. You always have been. The truth is, you've been trying to escape yourself. You've been looking for something outside of you, something to explain the fear, the anger, the frustration. But the answer was inside you all along. The course, this endless cycle of choice and consequence, is you. You are the architect of this place." Jason's pulse quickened, his vision blurred. He could feel the walls of his reality crumbling, the ground beneath him shifting as though it could dissolve at any moment. But the more he tried to reject the figure's words, the clearer they became. What if it was true? What if all of it, the nightmares, the twisted games, the traps, and the illusions, had been his creation? What if he had built this labyrinth to keep himself locked in a cage of his own making? "No," Jason gasped, his voice breaking. I didn't choose this." The figure's eyes glittered with dark understanding. "You didn't choose it, no, but you did create it. Just as you've created every obstacle, every challenge, every roadblock in your life. You've spent so long running from yourself, from the things you fear, that you never realized you were building the very walls that held you prisoner. And now you're finally seeing the truth." Jason collapsed to his knees, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him like a stone. His breath was shallow, his hands trembling. He had spent so much time searching for answers outside himself, blaming the world, blaming the course, blaming the unknown. But the truth, terrifying, incomprehensible, and utterly consuming was that the course was him, and the only way out was to face himself, to confront the labyrinth he had created. The figure stepped forward, its hand outstretched, offering the final choice. You've reached the final hole, Jason. Will you continue to run, or will you finally accept the truth? Jason's mind screamed for escape, for a way out of this nightmare. But deep inside, he knew that there was no escape, only acceptance, only the truth. And as the figure's hand hovered just above his own, Jason closed his eyes, his body trembling with the weight of the final decision. For the first time, Jason knew what he had to do. He had to let go. Jason awoke with a sharp intake of breath, as though he had been underwater, and in that moment, he felt as though he had just crossed the threshold between two worlds. The weight of everything he had experienced, the illusions, the confusion, the constant spirals of terror and doubt, seemed to dissipate like mist in the morning sun. He was no longer in the place he had been trapped for so long, no longer standing on the edge of the void, staring into the abyss of his own psyche. But the sense of finality that lingered in the air told him that this was not merely an escape. This was the culmination of everything he had faced, everything he had come to understand. He opened his eyes to a familiar scene, the golf course. The manicured green stretched out before him, the crisp air carrying the scent of freshly cut grass. But something was different. The world around him seemed brighter, more vibrant, as though it were a reflection of the clarity that had begun to settle within his mind. The chaos, the uncertainty, the endless looping of past fears and anxieties had faded into the background, leaving only this moment. He was standing at the tee, golf club in hand, the final hole before him. And for the first time in a long time, Jason felt a strange sense of calm. The figure, his doppelganger, the manifestation of his darkest thoughts, was gone. In its place, there was only the stillness of the course. Jason could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant chirping of birds, and the gentle hum of his own breathing. There were no more games, no more traps, no more endless paths of decision that led nowhere. This was the end of the course, and it was here that Jason finally understood what had been missing all along, the ability to choose without fear. He approached the ball, his grip firm on the club. As he lined up his shot, memories of the twisted path he had walked resurfaced, but they were no longer suffused with dread. Instead, they were tinged with understanding. Every wrong turn, every mistake, every moment of terror had been a part of the process. They had not been obstacles to be defeated, but lessons to be learned. Jason realized that the course was not just a physical place. It was a reflection of life itself, with all its uncertainties, challenges, and unexpected turns. And now, standing at the final hole, he understood that the true test was not in conquering the course, but in accepting it as it was. As Jason swung the club, the ball flew through the air, its trajectory perfect. It soared towards the hole, a symbol of everything he had overcome, of the clarity he had finally gained. The ball landed softly on the green, rolling gently toward the cup. There was no rush, no anxiety about whether or not it would fall in. It was the natural progression of the game, of life. And as the ball dropped into the hole with a satisfying thud, Jason felt a deep, resonant sense of peace settle over him. But this wasn't the end in the way he had imagined it. There was no triumphant finish, no applause, no grand revelation of some hidden truth. Instead, there was simply acceptance. The course was not a thing to be conquered. It was a part of him, a part of the journey that led to this moment. And now that it was over, Jason felt no desire to look back. There were no more questions, no more need for answers. He had come to terms with the labyrinth that had once held him captive. He stood there on the final hole, watching the ball come to rest. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faintest whisper, like a voice from the past. It was not a voice of accusation or fear. It was a voice of release, of freedom. The course had no power over him anymore. He had become the architect of his own path, the creator of his own destiny. And with that realization, Jason knew that the course he had been playing was no longer a game. It had been a journey, his journey. As he turned away from the hole and began walking back toward the clubhouse, a profound sense of clarity washed over him. The landscape around him seemed brighter now, as if every blade of grass, every leaf, every cloud in the sky had been renewed. He no longer felt the weight of the doppelganger's presence, no longer felt the heavy hand of fear guiding his every step. It was as if he had shed the last remnants of his old self, the one who had been lost in the maze of his own making. Now he was simply Jason, and for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be free. But freedom, Jason realized, was not a place to be reached. It wasn't an end. It was a state of being, a choice to stop fighting against the world, against oneself. The course had not been a prison. It had been a reflection of his internal struggle. And now that the struggle had ended, Jason was no longer bound by it. He could walk away from the course, from the game, with his head held high, knowing that the true victory had been in the acceptance of himself. As Jason reached the clubhouse, he paused for a moment, looking back at the course that had once held him captive. The greens were peaceful now, serene in the quiet of the evening. The course was still there, but it no longer had the power to control him. The game was over, and Jason had won, not by overcoming the obstacles in front of him, but by realizing that the only thing he needed to conquer was himself. He smiled, stepping into the clubhouse. The final stroke had been made, and it was enough.